Good evening, Grove family. It is good to see you, even though it's via a lens. I really do miss being with you guys. I miss the laughter in the hallways. I miss the lingering after church. I just miss just that embodiment of our friends. And I really look forward to when we can get together again. I do thank you for your patience. Today turned out to be a very beautiful day, and I made a bad call on not doing drive-in church, and so I want to apologize to each of you, and we will do our best to make that happen at every possible opportunity. We've been walking through the book of Exodus and looking at the life of Moses, and so I want to invite you to turn to Exodus chapter 4 with me tonight. For a few moments, I want to examine a transition section in the life of Moses. And in this transition section, I want to kind of interview, if you will, different members of Moses' family. I want to talk with Moses. I want to talk with his father-in-law, and I want to talk with his wife. And as all of these conversations will hinge around the call of God. In the beginning of Exodus, we learned that God's people are under severe bondage, and it's only getting more and more severe. God begins to raise up a deliverer. That deliverer is going to come from the house of Pharaoh, but it's going to be the Hebrew boy. Moses he's going to make a mistake. He's going to look this way and he's going to look that way, but he's going to fail to consider God is watching, and he's going to murder the Egyptian, and he is going to run. We find him running, and he finds a wife in Midian. Her father is a priest, and he has at least a job for Moses to do, and that is to be a shepherd. And Moses is going to work with the flock. One day while at work, he sees a bush that's on fire, but something looks odd about it. So he ventures over to the bush, notices that it is on fire for sure, but yet it's not being consumed. Draws a little closer, and there's conversation now that he's having with this bush, but he's not talking to a bush. The bush is inhabited by God himself. And so Moses and God begin this very lengthy dialogue beginning in chapter 3, verse 1, and concluding in chapter 4, verse 17. And in those verses, God has one objective, and that's he's calling Moses. He's drawing that line in the sand. He's making a very clear call to this now shepherd leader. And the call is going to be one of deliverer. He's going to take Moses and send him back to Egypt, and it's time to deliver the people. Moses has an exchange back and forth with the Lord. Some Bible preachers see that exchange as being Moses is offering excuse after excuse, trying to weasel out. However, I don't see that in the text, and we've discussed that already. But I don't see Moses weaseling. If you want to see weaseling, you go to the book of Jonah and look at a man. There's weaseling. He pays his own way to go in the opposite direction, and even when he knows this storm is about him, he's still very reluctant. Even when God does send miracle after miracle, provision after provision, revival after revival, he still sits on the coastline waiting for God to destroy. So that's weaseling. Moses, I don't think, is weaseling. I think Moses is just wanting to make very certain that this is from God and that God's going to be with him in this endeavor. So Moses, when verse 17 is over, Let me read just 2 or 3 verses tonight for our study. And that's Exodus chapter 4, verses 18, 19, and 20. Then Moses departed and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please, let me go that I may return to my brethren who are in Egypt and see if they are still alive." Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead." So Moses took his wife and his sons, and he mounted them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. Moses also took the staff of God in his hand. Like I said earlier, these are transition verses. They are taking us from the burning bush to Jethro to Egypt. And when we come to chapter 5, Moses he's going to be there in Egypt. What is the purpose of these transition verses other than simply filling in some narration for our account? Well, I want to interview the different players, the different members, the different people involved in this call. First, let's look at Moses for just a moment. An observation that I make is in verse 18. It says, "Moses departed and he returned to Jethro, his father-in-law." And then in verse 20, we read, "So Moses took his wife and his sons and mounted them on a donkey and returned to the land of Egypt." Why does Moses and Jethro have this conversation? What is the conversation? Well, the conversation is, I'm leaving. I need to quit my job, and I'm taking my family back to Egypt. He needs to have that conversation because Jethro is, in essence, his employer. Verse 20, he has another conversation. We don't see that conversation, but it obviously happened. We see that Moses is taking his family. What am I trying to say? Here's what my observation is. Chapter 3, all the way to chapter 4, verse 17, is exclusively about the call of Moses. God is calling a man to do his assignment. But here's what I want us all to kind of understand, put into perspective. You may be watching and you are called. You're called to pastor. You are called vocationally, whether part-time or full-time, but you're vocationally called. Maybe you're watching and you aren't vocationally called, but you have had a call on your life to serve in a secular context, but as a missionary. The call is vast and it is numerous. But what we've got to keep in mind is that when God calls a man to work, when God calls a woman into service, that call does not just impact them. My call and my obedience to that call has ripple effects on other people in 2 ways. One way is on the people in Egypt. The people in Egypt are suffering. The people in Egypt are under the oppressive hand of a tyrant Pharaoh. The people in Egypt are enslaved. They do not have their own rights. They are enslaved to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And their prayers, they are crying out to God that he would rescue them. He would set them free. He would give them freedom. God calling Moses at a bush is part of the answer to their prayer in Egypt. And when God calls you, when God puts that conviction and that compulsion on the heart of a man or a woman, when he's calling them to an assignment, make very certain that you are aware that part of that call impacts other people. And if I'm not obedient to that call, it doesn't just affect me, it affects others. And the flip side is true. When I am obedient to the call, it doesn't just affect me, it affects others. It has lasting and long-reaching ripple effects. So please, as it relates to the call, when God gives an assignment, it's not just going to impact you. It will impact others. Here's something else that I observe. Where is Moses going? He's going back to Egypt. The text tells us in verse 19 that the people who were looking for Moses, they're now dead. So in one part, this period in Midian has been to outlive his accusers. And sometimes God leads in that way. You may not understand why your ministry is not going in the direction you'd like it to go. Maybe it's because God is waiting for some people to die. And upon their death, now it is time to move. But Moses is going back to Egypt. There's anxieties there. There's difficulties there. Not only with the Egyptians, but also with his own people. It's been 4 decades since he's been there. So here's a man who's many of the people he did know, they could be dead. These are people that know him as a murderer. When God gives you an assignment, the assignment is not necessarily always a step up. It's not always an assignment that is better than the one you're doing now. Better in the sense that it's more comfortable, it's more enjoyable, it's more delightful, it's less painful. That's not always how I know this is the will of God. Sometimes the will of God is such that it feels like a demotion. Moses, he understands that these decisions are not made in vacuums, that there are real people with real effects that are impacting the people around them. Another observation that I think is important about that I find in this passage. Verse 20 says that he packs up his family, he mounts the donkey, and he returns to the land of Egypt. It's been decades. I'm 45. Longest I've lived in any one area is about 10 years. And I know that in living in a place for about 10 years, even that's a short time. Many of you have never moved. You've been in the same place for decades. Can you imagine God giving you an assignment that would demand that you relocate? And let's say you're relocating after being in a place for 30 years. What kind of difficulties are you having there? What adjustments will you have to make in your own mind? Forget the physical adjustments, the new address, the new home, the new friends. Forget all those things, but just in your own mind. They relocate to Egypt. I don't know much about his wife. I don't know how much traveling she ever did, but potentially it's very likely that this is all she's ever known. So now you're taking somebody who's never left home or been far away from home, and now you're asking her to move. What does all of that mean? It means this. Most of the time, when God gives you an assignment, when God calls you to something, it requires leaving. It doesn't always mean you have to move and change addresses. But likely it means I've got to leave some things behind. I've got to change something. There's an aspect of leaving behind. This keeps a lot of men from answering the call, because to answer the call would be to step out of security and into insecurity, to step out of comfort and into unknown. And unfortunately, that prevents many from obeying and following through with what God wants them to do. And so I just want to challenge you that if you feel the compulsion, if you believe God is, if He's calling you into vocational work, if He is calling you into marketplace missionary work, if He is calling you to a particular assignment, but a hurdle that you have in answering that and saying yes to that is, look what I've got to turn loose of. Let me just encourage you. If God is certainly asking you to turn loose, Satan wants to think you won't find anything equal to the joy of what you turn loose. But God wants you to know that there is far greater joy in turning loose in obedience to grab hold of in obedience to His will. Far greater joy. So be encouraged to do that. That's a little bit about Moses. Let me go kind of Moses and his wife for a second. Another observation I'm making, we don't have any text for this, so but I know it happened. I just don't know how it happened. At some point, Moses had to summarize or retell Exodus 3 through 4:17 to his wife. When he goes back home that night and says, all right, honey, it's time to go back to Egypt, she's going to say, why and how do you know? And he's going to begin to explain, potentially even showing her his staff and throwing it down, turning into a serpent, picking it up, very possibly reenacting many of those things. If God has put a call on your life, I believe He also puts a very clear call. And what you've got to make sure you do is make sure you are very clear with your family, explaining your call, and then being patient with them. It appears that everybody goes willingly. We don't hear, it appears that the heart of Jethro is the heart of Moses' wife, because Jethro says, go in peace. And so it appears that the rest of the family is thinking that and saying that. Moses is, I need to consider my family, and I need to have conversation with my family, but I need to be very careful that I do not confuse the call of God with our own preferences as a family. And so I see Moses doing that with his wife. He had to have had conversations with his sons. This is the only home they've ever known. Let me shift from Moses to his wife for a second. Ladies, your husband may be called, or your husband may be being called, or you may marry someone who will be called. If God calls a man, He also calls the family. And as God has called me, I've got to have very, very candid conversations with my wife about, hey, do you feel that you can support me as I follow this call? Do you feel God has called you in the same way? Holly and I were, we've known each other most of our life. I met her when I was about 12 years old, and we're about 3.5 years apart. We were friends for a long time. Point came, we dated for about 6 months. We then were engaged, and then we were married 6 months after that. So we were in relationship for about a year before we were married. And in that 12-month period, I asked her on a couple of occasions, God has called me into ministry because I've been serving for several years at that point. And I asked her, I said, do you feel called to be a pastor's wife? And she never, in her wildest imaginations, ever envisioned her being that. She never saw herself in that role or in that capacity. She has been an excellent one. You would never know that at one time that was never on her radar. She has followed that call very well. We were married in June 7th, 1997, and not long after that, we were packing our very minimal belongings, and we were moving to North Carolina to go to seminary. I felt God was sending me to seminary. And Holly she's in the same position as Moses' wife here. She'd never been out of Woodbury, Tennessee. She always lived near her family. That was just home. And here comes some city boy taking her away to a place she's never been, neither of us have ever been. See, I almost think it takes more faith on our spouses sometimes because they didn't hear or get my call. They are trusting my call and following me. And so I want to commend the spouses of people who are serving in ministry because you have quietly, behind the scenes, made some very self-sacrificing decisions. And I want to say thank you. And I want us to be aware that when God calls one person of the family, He's really calling all of us. It's a family endeavor. So we looked a little bit at Moses. We looked a little bit at his wife. Let me close. Let me wrap up with Jethro. Jethro is daddy, and I am a daddy, and one day a conversation like this might be had. So Moses goes to Jethro in verse 18, and I don't know what's going through Moses' veins. I don't know what kind of relationship they have. Evidently, it's a pretty solid one because Jethro is going to speak very candidly later in this book to Moses about his leadership style. But it could be a nerving statement because what's Moses asking? He's essentially asking two things. He's saying, one, here's my 2-week notice, and two, I'm taking your daughter and your grandchildren away from you. They don't have Zoom meetings. They don't have FaceTime. They don't have YouTube Live. They don't have Facebook Live. And Jethro says, go on. Go in peace. Jethro says a lot right here. One of the things that I admire about Jethro, from what we have, I don't have any other conversations, but from what we have here, Jethro seems to trust his family with the Lord. And that sometimes means letting them go to go serve. I don't want to be the parent who holds my child back because I love them so much and I don't want them to leave. Here's a very real struggle that parents of called children need to weigh in on and be careful with. I've got to be careful not to let my love for my child to become an idol. Is it possible that my love for my children can become an idol? How? If I prevent them from doing what I know in my spirit is the thing of the Lord, but I just don't want to because I don't want to see him leave. I don't want to see him go. I love him too much. We've just always been a close family. I don't want him to go. I have allowed my love for my children to be an idol, which becomes a hindrance and a barrier and a stumbling block for them obeying the Lord. And if I do that, I am highly likely to put false guilt on them. I am highly likely to give them counsel that has taken my will and my preferences and made them equal to the will of the Lord. Now, I've got to be very careful. And I think it's just healthy for us to speak to parents of called children. I know I have parents listening that you have children that are called into ministry. And it takes just as much faith to let them go as it does for them to answer the call. You see, the call impacts everybody. And so parents of children in the ministry, I want to encourage you that your children need you and they need your prayers. And when you can honestly and in the faith of the Lord say what Moses or what Jethro did, peace be with you. That is the strong arm of God at work. It's difficult for everyone. But the call requires a lot of people to trust. Father, as we have looked at a man who willingly, not without conversation, but willingly answered your call. We see a wife who understood and knew that call was genuine, and she followed. Self-sacrificing, she followed. And then we see a daddy, a father-in-law, who doesn't stand in the way, but he gives his blessings. Let us find deep encouragement, God, because this is how it should be done. Father, thank you for my own church family, for my friends and those that I love, and I pray you help us to pastor well during this time. Jesus, you are good and you are gracious, and we ask this in your name. Amen. Thank you, brothers and sisters. You have a blessed night and a wonderful week in the Lord, and I look forward to seeing you soon.